I'm ready for another chapter of the BFG. This one is called Dreams. We'll find out what is in the giant's dream jars. The big friendly giant was seated at the great table in his cave, and he was doing his homework. Sophie sat cross-legged on the tabletop nearby, watching him at work. The glass jar containing the one and only good dream they had caught that day stood between them. The BFG, with great care and patience, was printing something on a piece of paper with an enormous pencil. "What are you writing?" Sophie asked him. "Every dream is having a special label on the bottle," the BFG said. "How else could I be finding the one I am wanting in a hurry?" "But can you really and truly tell what sort of dream it's going to be by simply listening to it?" Sophie asked. "I can," said the BFG, looking up. "But how? Is it by the way it hums and buzzes?" "Well, you was less or more right," the BFG said. "Every dream in the world is making a different sort of buzzy hum music, and these grand swashbuckling ears of mine is able to read that music." "By music, do you mean tunes?" "I is not meaning tunes." "Then what do you mean?" "Human beings is having their own music, right or left." "Right," said Sophie. "Lots of music." And oops. Sometimes human beings is very overcome when they is hearing wondrous music. They is getting shivers down their spindles, right or left." "Right," said Sophie. "So the music is saying something to them. It is sending a message. I do not think the human beings is knowing what that message is, but they is loving it just the same." That's about right," said Sophie. "And because of these jump-squiggling ears of mine," the BFG said, "I is not only able to hear the music that dreams is making, but I is understanding it also." "What do you mean, understanding it?" Sophie asked. "I can read it," said the BFG. "It talks to me, like a language." "I find that a little hard to believe," Sophie said. "I bet you is also finding it hard to believe in Grogwinkle," said the BFG, "and how they is visiting us from the stars." "Of course I don't believe that," Sophie said. The BFG regarded her gravely with those huge eyes of his. "I hope you will forgive me," he said, "if I tell you that human beings is thinking they is very clever, but they is not. They is nearly all of them not muchers and squeak pips." And here they are, sitting at the table. "I beg your pardon," Sophie said. "The matter with human beings," the BFG went on, "is that they is absolutely refusing to believe in anything unless they is actually seeing it right in front of their own schnozzles. Of course Grogwinkles is existing. I is meeting them oftenly. I is even chittering to them." He turned away contemptuously from Sophie and resumed his writing. Sophie moved over to read and what he had written so far. The letters that were printed were big and bold, but were not very well formed. Here is what they said. "This dream is about how I is saving my teacher from drowning. I is diving into the river from a high bridge, and I is dragging my teacher to the bank, and then I is giving him the kiss of death." "The kiss of what?" Sophie asked. The BFG stopped writing and raised his head slowly. His eyes rested on Sophie's face. "I is telling you once before," he said quietly, "that I is never having a chance to go to school. I is full of mistakes. They is not my fault. I do my best. You is a lovely little girl, but please remember that you is not exactly Miss Know-Everything yourself." "I'm sorry," Sophie said. "I really am. It is very rude of me to keep correcting you." The BFG gazed at her for a while longer, and then he bent his head again to his slow, laborious writing. "Tell me honestly," Sophie said, "if you blew this dream into my bedroom when I was asleep, would I really and truly start dreaming about how I saved my teacher from drowning off and by diving off a bridge?" "More," said the BFG, "a lot more. But I cannot be scribbling the whole grob-flunking dream on a titchy bit of paper. Of course there is more." The BFG had laid his pencil down and placed one massive ear close to the jar. For about 30 seconds he listened intently. "Yes," he said, nodding his great head up and down, "this dream is continuing very nice. It has a very dory-hunky ending." "How does it end?" said Sophie. "Please tell me." "You would be dreaming," said the BFG, that the morning after you was saving the teacher from the river, you was arriving at school and you was seeing all the 500 pupils sitting in the assembly hall and all the teachers as well, and the head teacher is then standing up and saying, I is wanting the whole school to give 3 cheers for Sophie because she is so brave for saving the life of our fine arithmetic teacher, Mr. Figgins, who was unfortunately pushed off the bridge into the river by our gym teacher, Miss Amelia Upscotch. So 3 cheers for Sophie. And the whole school is then cheering like mad and shouting bravo, well done, and forever after that. Even when you was getting your sums all gun-swiggled and muggled up, Mr. Figgins is always giving you 10 out of 10 and writing good work, Sophie, in your exercise book. Then you is waking up. I like that dream, Sophie said. Of course you like it, said the BFG. It is a fizz wizard. He licked the back of the label and stuck it on the jar. I is usually writing a bit more than this on the labels, he said, but you is watching me and making me jumpsy. Oh, I'll go sit somewhere else, said Sophie. Don't go, he said. Look at the jar carefully, and I think you will be seeing the dream. Sophie peered into the jar, and there, sure enough, she saw the faint, translucent outline of something about the size of a hen's egg. There was just a touch of color in it, a pale sea green, soft and shimmering and very beautiful. There it lay, this small, oblong, greenish jellyish thing at the bottom of the jar, quite peaceful, but pulsing gently, the whole of it moving in and out ever so slightly as though it were breathing. It's moving, said Sophie. It's alive. Of course it's alive. What will you feed it on? Sophie asked. It is not needing any food, the BFG told her. Well, that's cruel, Sophie said. Everything alive needs some sort of food, even trees and plants. The north wind is alive, said the BFG. It is moving. It touches you in the cheek and on the hands, but nobody is feeding it. Sophie went silent. This extraordinary giant was disturbing her ideas. He seemed to be leading her towards mysteries that were beyond her understanding. A dream is not needing anything, the BFG went on. If it is a good one, it is waiting peaceably forever until it is released and allowed to do its job. If it is a bad one, it is always fighting to get out. The BFG stood up and walked over to one of the many shelves and placed the latest jar among the thousands of others. Please, can I see some of the other dreams? Sophie asked him. The BFG hesitated. Nobody is ever seeing them before, he said. But perhaps after all I is letting you have a little peep. He picked her up off the table and stood her on the palm of one of his huge hands. He carried her towards the shelves. Over here is some of the good dreams, he said, the fizz wizards. Would you hold me closer so I can read the labels? Sophie asked. My labels is only telling bits of it, the BFG said. The dreams is usually much longer. The labels is just to remind me. Sophie started to read the labels. The first one seemed long enough to her. It went right around the jar, and as she read it, she had to keep turning the jar. This is what it said. Today I is sitting in class, and I discover that if I is staring very hard at my teacher in a special way, I is able to put her to sleep. So I keep staring at her, and in the end, her head drops onto her desk, and she goes fast asleep and snorkles loudly. Then in marches the head teacher, and he shouts, Wake up, Miss Plumridge, and dare you go to sleep in class. Go fetch your hat and coat and leave the school forever. You is sacked. But in a jiffy, I is putting the head teacher to sleep as well, and he just crumples slowly to the floor like a lump of jelly, and there he lies all in a heap and starts snorkeling even louder than Miss Plumridge. Then I is hearing my mummy's voice saying, Wake up, your breakfast is ready. Oh, that's a funny dream, said Sophie. It's a ring beller, said BFG. It's a wopsy. Inside the jar, just below the edge of the label, Sophie could see the putting to sleep dream lying peacefully on the bottom, pulsing gently, sea green like the other one, but perhaps a trifle larger. Do you have separate dreams for boys and girls? Sophie asked. Of course, said the BFG. If I was giving a girl's dream to a boy, even if it was a real wopsy girl's dream, the boy would be waking up and thinking what a rot-bungling, grink-sludging old dream that was. Boys would, said Sophie. These here is the girl's dreams on this shelf, the BFG said. Can I read a boy's dream? You can, said the BFG, and he lifted her higher on the shelf. The label on the nearest boy's dream jar read as follows. I is making myself a marvelous pair of suction boots, and when I put them on, I is able to walk straight up the kitchen wall and across the ceiling. Well, I is walking upside down on the ceiling when my big sister comes in, and she starts to yell at me, as she always does, yelling, "What on earth is you doing up there walking on the ceiling?" And I looks down at her and smiles, and I said, "I told you you was driving me up the wall, and now you has done it." "Oh, that one's rather silly," said Sophie. "Boys wouldn't think so," said the BFG. "It's another ring beller. Perhaps you have seen enough now." "Oh, let me read another boy's one," said Sophie. The next label said, "The telephone rings in our house, and my father picks it up and says in his very important telephone voice, 'Simpkins speaking,' and then his face goes white and his voice goes all funny, and he says, 'What? Who?' And then he says, 'Yes, sir, I understand, but surely it is me you is wishing to speak to, sir, not my little son.' My father's face is going from white to dark purple, and he is gulping like he has a lobster stuck in his throat. And then at last he is saying, 'Yes, sir, very well, sir, I will get him, sir.' And he turns to me and he says in a rather respectful voice, 'Is you knowing the President of the United States?' And I is saying, 'No, but I expect he is hearing about me.' Then I is having a long talk on the phone and saying things like, 'Let me take care of it, Mr. President. You'll bungle it all up if you do it your way.' And my father's eyes is googling right out of his head. And that is why I is hearing my father's real voice saying, 'Get up, you lazy slobber, you'll be late for school.'" "Boys are crazy," Sophie said. "Let me read the next one," said Sophie, staring at the next label. "I is having a bath, and I am discovering that if I press quite hard on my tummy button, a funny feeling comes over me, and suddenly my legs is not there, nor my arms. In fact, I has become absolutely invisible all over. I is still there, but no one can see me, not even myself. So my mummy comes in and says, 'Where is that child? He was in the bath a minute ago, and he can't possibly have washed himself properly.' And so I says, 'Here I is,' and she says, 'Where?' And I said, 'Here.' And she says, 'Where?' And I says, 'Here.' And she always says, 'Where?' And I says, 'Here.' And she yells, 'Henry, come up quick.' And when my daddy rushes in, I is washing myself, and my daddy sees the soap floating around in the air, but of course he is not seeing me, and he shouts, 'Where are you, boy?' And I say, 'Here.' And he says, 'Where?' And I say, 'Here.' And he says, 'Where?' And I say, 'Here.' And he is saying, 'The soap, boy, the soap, it's flying in the air.' Then I press my tummy button again, and now I is visible. My daddy is squiffy with excitement, and he says, 'You is the invisible boy.' And I say, 'Now I is going to have some fun.' So when I get out of the bath and I have dried myself and put on my dressing gown and slippers, I press my tummy button again and become invisible, and I go down the town and walk in the streets. Of course, only me is invisible, but not the thing I is wearing. So the people is seeing a dressing gown and slippers floating along down the street with nobody in it, and there is a panic with everybody yelling, 'A ghost, a ghost!' And people is screaming left and right, and big strong policemen is running for their lives, and best of all, I see Mr. Grummet, my algebra teacher, coming out of the pub, and I float up to him and I say, 'Boo!' And he lets out a frightsome howl and dashes back into the pub, and then I is waking up and feeling happy as a whiff squiggler." Would you like that one? "Pretty ridiculous," said Sophie. "Ridiculous," said Sophie. All the same, she couldn't resist reaching down and pressing her own tummy button to see if it worked. Nothing happened. "Dreams is very mystical things," said the BFG. "Human beings is not understanding them all. Not even the brainiest professors is understanding them. Has you seen enough? Oh, just one more. This one here." She started reading. "I has written a book, and it is so exciting no one can put it down. As soon as you has read the first line, you is so hooked you cannot stop until the last page. In all the cities, people is walking in the streets bumping into each other because their faces is buried in my book, and dentists is reading it, trying to fill teeth at the same time, but nobody minds because they is all reading it too in the dentist chair. Drivers is reading it while driving their cars, and cars is all crashing all over the country. Brain surgeons is reading it, so while they are operating on brains and airline pilots is reading it and going to Timbuktu instead of London, football players are reading it on the field because they can't put it down, and so is the Olympic runners while they is running. Everybody has to see what is going to happen next in my book. And when I wake up, I is still tingling with excitement and of being the greatest writer in the world and has ever known until my mummy comes in and says, I was looking at your English exercise book last night, and really your spelling is atrocious, and so is your punctuation. That's enough for now, the BFG said. There is a dillions more, but my arm is getting tired from holding you up. What are all those over there? Why have they got such tiny labels? That, said the BFG, is because one day I is catching so many dreams, I is not having the time or energy to write out long labels. But there is enough to remind me. Can I look? Sophie said. The long-suffering BFG carried her across to the jars she was pointing to. Sophie read them one after another. 1. I is climbing Mount Everest with just my pussycat for company. I is inventing a car that runs on toothpaste. I is able to make the electric lights go on by just wishing it. I is only an 8-year-old little boy, but I is growing a splendid bushy beard and all the other boys is jealous. I is able to jump out of a high window and float down safely. I has a pet bee that makes rock and roll music when it flies. That amazes me, how you ever learned to write in the first place. Ah, said the BFG, I has been wondering how long it is before you is asking me that. Considering you never went to school, I think it's quite marvelous, Sophie said. How did you learn? The BFG crossed the cave and opened a tiny screen door in the wall. He took out a book, a very old and tattered. By human standards, it was an ordinary-sized book, but it looked like a postage stamp in his huge hand. One night, he said, I was blowing a dream through a window, and I sees this book lying on the little boy's bedroom table. I wanted it so very badly, you understand, but I was refusing to steal it. I would never do that. So how did you get it? Sophie asked. I borrowed it, said the BFG, smiling a little. Just for a short time, I borrowed it. How long have you had it? Sophie asked. Oh, perhaps only 80 years, said the BFG. Soon I shall be putting it back. And that's how you taught yourself to write? Sophie asked him. I is reading it hundreds of times, said the BFG, and I is still reading it and teaching new words to myself and how to write them. It is the most scrumptious story. Sophie took out the book and it said, Nicholas Nickleby, she read out loud. By Dolls Chickens, said the BFG. By who? Sophie asked. Just then there came an enormous noise of galloping feet from outside the cave. What's that? Sophie cried. Oh, that is all the giants zip-fizzing off to another country to guzzle human beings, the BFG said. He quickly popped Sophie into his pocket and hurried to the cave entrance and rolled back the stone. Sophie, peeping out of her spy hole, saw all 9 of the fearsome giants coming past at full gallop. Where is you off to tonight? Shouted the BFG. We is all of us flesh-bunking off to England tonight, shouted the flesh lump eater as they went galloping past. England is a lunctious land, and we is fancying a few nice little English chidlers. I, said the maid masher, is knowing where there is a giggle house for girls, and I is guzzling myself full of froth blower. And I know where there is a boggle box for boys, said the gizzard gulper. All I have to do is reach in and grab me a handful. English boys is tasting extra liquishy. In a few seconds, the 9 galloping giants were out of sight. What did he mean? Sophie said, poking her head out. What is a giggle house for girls? He is meaning a girls' school, said the BFG. He will be eating them by the bundle. Oh, no. And boys from a boys' school, said the BFG. It mustn't happen, Sophie cried out. We've got to stop them. We can't just sit here and do nothing. There is not a thing we can do, the BFG said. We is as helpless as horse feathers. He sat down on a large, craggy blue rock near the entrance to his cave. He took Sophie from his pocket and put her behind him on the rock. It is now quite safe for you to be outside until they is coming back, he said. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and it was getting dark. And that's the end of this long chapter. See you tomorrow.